If I asked you to name the single most underrated video game genre in history, what would spring to mind? Turn-based strategy, maybe? How about scrolling shooters, or even the oft-maligned sports game? You could make a case for any of these, but no genre has ever struck me as being more unfairly ignored than puzzle games. The puzzle genre boasts one of the most prolific and varied catalogs of any genre in history. Good puzzle games have an appeal that extends to all ages, drawing in gamers and non-gamers alike, and they can even make you smarter. So why is it that so few puzzle games have a place set aside for them in the pantheon of historically important games? I think there's two major factors at work here. First, the broad appeal of puzzle games is actually one of the biggest things that some people have against it. To be frank, many popular puzzle games have a reputation for being aimed at people who don't normally play video games, and that makes a lot of gamers dismiss them right off the bat. Myst had a reputation for being played by suburban moms. So did the big PopCap successes of the 2000s, like Bejeweled and Zuma. Brain Age sold more copies back in its day than Super Smash Bros. Ultimate did last year, but its success wasn't generated by the gaming community. It was non-gamer adults that drove those sales, including a ton of old people. Gaming culture and criticism still skew very young and very aggressive, and if a game doesn't appeal to this demographic, you probably won't be seeing it at the Game Awards anytime soon. The second problem, and probably the more important one, is built right into the structure of the genre. It's the fact that most puzzle games don't have a story or characters to engage the player with. Like it or not, to lots of gamers and critics, a video game is basically a player-controlled movie, and accordingly games are often valued more for the quality and execution of their set pieces than the quality and execution of their mechanics. I'm certainly not immune from this. I place a lot of importance on storytelling and presentation, and games that rely on mechanical depth to engage the player often leave me cold. I would far rather play a story-driven puzzle game like Portal 2 than a mechanics-driven experience like Super Hexagon, for instance. So why, despite all this, do I say that puzzle games are underrated? Because a good puzzle game can use its mechanics and presentation to come up with something that works just as well as a story. In fact, something that a lot of games with stories don't have. A unique personality. And today we're going to explore a little-known series that's packed with personality, the puzzling pastime known as Picross. As its name suggests, Picross is basically a number game where the crossing of two sets of numbers creates a picture. For each row and column, a list of numbers outside the picture tells you how many groups of filled-in squares are in the line and how long each group is. It's the player's job to logically work out which squares have to be filled in, and which can't be, using these numbers. In print form, these puzzles are often called nonograms, after their Japanese inventor Non Ishida, who incidentally was inspired by his own previous work making grid pictures with window lights and skyscrapers. Nonograms were invented around the same time as modern Sudoku puzzles, and in fact, Picross has a lot in common with Sudoku. Nonograms never reached the same level of cultural ubiquity that Sudoku did, but personally I think they're a lot more interesting, because when you're finished, you get a neat picture, whereas with Sudoku, all you get is a bunch of numbers and a vague feeling of superiority over the rest of the human race. Another good thing about nonograms is that as they increase in size, the pictures they create can become more detailed and interesting to look at. You don't have to be a digital artist to know that a higher resolution means better-looking graphics. With their emphasis on visual presentation, nonograms were an obvious choice to be adapted into a puzzle game. And in 1995, that's exactly what Nintendo, through its subsidiary Jupiter Corporation, and with the help of Shigesato Itoi's Ape Inc., proceeded to do. Yes, you read that right. This is one of those weird Mario spin-offs that used to be so popular back in the 90s, when apparently Mario was going through the mother of all midlife crises and kept changing his job every couple of months. In this one, Mario's an archaeologist who finds a bunch of puzzles in an ancient tomb that he has to solve with his hammer and chisel, or else, I don't know, the game doesn't exactly have a plot. Maybe he gets eaten by a mummy or something. The archaeology theme is kind of clever, but I have to say, the fact that this is the first Picross game ever really shows. The mechanics are awkward and slow, and it's way too easy to make mistakes that cost you time. You have 1 hour to solve each puzzle, which may seem like a lot, but you have to remember that not only do you lose time for mistakes, but each mistake after the first costs you more time than the last. Later games in the series had this hour-long time limit too, but at least they have better controls. Mario's Picross was much more of a hit in Japan than in the US, so when the time came for a sequel, Nintendo decided not to release it here. We wouldn't get another Picross game until more than a decade later, but fortunately for puzzle fans everywhere, when Jupiter came back on the scene, they came back with a bang. Picross DS is a deceptively deep game. The first time I fired it up, I had already played several of Jupiter's later Picross games, and I assumed that Picross DS was just a hard copy version of the same thing. I was way off. First of all, there are more than 300 puzzles in this game, and the vast majority of them are 15 by 15 or larger. More importantly, the pictures are all animated. Every time you finish a puzzle, the monochrome picture fills up with color and goes through an animation loop that lasts about 5 seconds. These little sprite art vignettes are the most charming part of the whole game, and they do a lot to sell the uniqueness of each puzzle. Another innovation of Picross DS was the introduction of free mode. In this mode, the game acts like you're working the puzzle out on paper, so it doesn't register any mistakes you make. This means that you don't have to worry about time penalties, but it also means that if you make a mistake, the game won't correct it, forcing you to be much more careful about your decisions. In other words, free mode is actually hard mode for Picross. It takes away a crutch that a lot of players probably didn't even realize they were using. The free mode puzzles in Picross DS are still the hardest ones I've ever played in a 2D Picross game. Note that qualifier, though, because there are harder Picross puzzles out there. It's just that they come from another dimension. Literally. Picross 3D was made by HAL Laboratory in 2010, and it is seriously one of the quirkiest puzzle games I've ever played. Its mascot is some kind of horrible Picasso-esque abomination of geometry, and the gameplay is essentially sculpting by numbers. Instead of filling in the right cubes and leaving the rest blank, in Picross 3D you leave the marked cubes alone completely, and then smash the wrong cubes into dust. It's very cathartic. And when you're done, your little cubist sculpture comes to life and starts doing a little animation. It's cute. Picross 3D also has a bunch of gallery areas where you can see the puzzles you've completed and what themes they fall into, along with little factoids about the thing each puzzle represents. I have to admit, I'm a sucker for stuff like this. Pikmin 2, Castlevania, Paper Mario. Basically, give me a little flavor text encyclopedia, and I'll dive into that sucker like a 6-year-old kid diving into the ball pit at a McDonald's play place. All in all, Picross 3D was a very unique and very fun game. However, Picross wasn't done evolving yet. In fact, some of the most intriguing twists on the nonogram format were yet to come. So it's 2011. Picross 3D just came out last year for the old and busted DS, and Nintendo has just released its new hotness, the 3DS. However, you might remember that the 3DS didn't sell particularly well when it first came out, so it needed some help. Jupiter decided that the best thing it could do to support the 3DS was to switch up its format and start making smaller, downloadable games that it could put out more often. Hey, it worked for Valve. Sort of. This was the genesis of Picross E, a series of 8 fun-sized Picross games released on the 3DS eShop. The first of these was a pretty generic iteration on Picross DS, but over the next two, Jupiter would introduce 2 alternate game modes to shake things up, Mega Picross and Micross. Mega Picross was the first major change to Picross's mechanics in more than a decade, sort of like when Pokemon introduced the Fairy type in Generation 6, only not as embarrassing. In this mode, 2 columns or rows in various parts of the puzzle would be mushed together, meaning that instead of a straight line of squares, the numbers now referred to a tetromino-like shape that snaked across both lines. This was an interesting idea. If anything, the problem was that a lot of the puzzles barely used it, which made Mega Picross feel kind of like an afterthought. Micross, on the other hand, didn't really change the mechanics at all, but it did more to distinguish itself in the personality department. In Micross, you solve a rudimentary 8x8 puzzle, and then each filled-in square itself becomes a 10x10 puzzle for you to solve. Once you've finished solving them, all the different tiles then come together to form an elaborate picture. Now here's the neat part. For the E-series, every Micross puzzle was basically a low-res version of a real painting by a famous artist. Jupiter didn't stick to the household names either. There was stuff by Vermeer, Manet, Gauguin, Japan Man, and so on. By the way, speaking of fine art and portable gaming, there's this amazing video on YouTube of someone recreating Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring in Art Academy for the DS. Seriously, you have to watch it. There's a link in the description. As well as the E-series, Jupiter also released several branded Picross games over the last decade, including the technically free but full of sleazy microtransaction BS Pokemon Picross, and the best thing I've ever heard of in my life, Sanrio Picross. True story. If it hadn't been for Sanrio Picross, I would never have known that one of Sanrio's most popular mascots is an anthropomorphic slice of raw fish, whose catchphrase is, I swear this is true, be sure to grill me up nicely. But I digress. While all this was going on, HAL Laboratory was hard at work making a sequel to Picross 3D, creatively named Picross 3D again, but different. No, seriously, it was called Picross 3D Round 2, and it made some significant changes to the formula, including the use of a new marking color which transforms cubes into other shapes, so everything doesn't have to look like art assets from an Atari Jaguar game anymore. That was the main positive change. On the downside, now instead of going through little animations when you finish them, all the puzzles just plonk onto a table and sit there, motionless, staring at you. Judging. Actually, based on the art design, it seems like everything in the game is supposed to be carved out of wood. It's a neat idea, but it takes away from the liveliness that the original Picross 3D had. Round 2 is definitely more fun to play, but the original felt a lot more freewheeling and creative. Still, at least Round 2 does more with the franchise than Jupiter's been doing for the last several years. Picross S, the Switch successor to the E games on 3DS, is about as derivative as it gets, and the series seems like it's at a loose end right now. I don't know where Picross is headed, but from where I stand, things look pretty bleak. Fortunately, while Nintendo may own the name Picross, they don't own the idea. If you type Nonogram into the Steam search bar, it comes back with dozens of results, including a really clever game I played a few years ago called Paint It Back. In this game, the premise is that an art gallery has had all its paintings erased, and you have to solve nonograms to bring the pictures back to their frames. Paint It Back has a lot of fun with this concept, and unlike the Picross series, it doesn't restrict itself to squarish shapes or 25 by 20 as a maximum size. Some of these puzzles get huge. It's a great challenge for players who've already mastered Picross. Now I'm just waiting for someone to do the same thing for Picross 3D. The more I play Picross, the more I realize that what attracts me to it isn't so much the challenge as the sense of surprise. One nice thing about puzzle games is that unlike, say, an RPG, in a puzzle game each chunk of gameplay can have a unique goal, not just your characters hopping up and down over and over again. This is probably why so many RPGs have puzzles in them, to keep player interest high by throwing you a curveball every now and then. Even when the puzzles aren't that hard, their mere existence changes your idea of how the game is played, and that can give a game a much greater sense of depth and even realism. But as much as I enjoy puzzles when they appear in other video game genres, an experience like Picross simply can't be replicated by a game that has other priorities, like storytelling and combat. Completing a picture in Picross is like assembling a jigsaw puzzle. It's a relaxing, self-paced pastime that leaves you with something beautiful when you're finished. Presentation matters. It especially matters with a game like Picross, which has mechanics that were more or less perfected 3 decades ago. You can find plenty of puzzle games out there which are as dry as sawdust because they don't do anything creative with the basic framework of the puzzle they're based on. The great puzzle games are the ones whose designers chose to have fun with the concept and do something unique. Without a unique presentation, the beloved Return of the Obra Dinn is just a big logic puzzle, basically a more elaborate version of this. The Witness becomes just a bunch of obtuse math problems, and one of my favorite games, Epistory Typing Chronicles, would degenerate into an online typing test that goes on for 6 hours. Presentation may just be wrapping paper for a game's mechanics, but as many 6-year-old kids know, sometimes the wrapping paper is more fun than the present.